Hello and welcome. My name's Michael Buckland. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute. And tonight we're here in the latest of, to have the latest of our In Conversation series, where we discuss some of the public policy books making the headlines. Tonight it's The Right Stuff, a collection of essays from thought leaders throughout the Labor movement. And we have two of them here tonight. The book contributes to a larger debate about the way forward and the agenda for reformist governments and social democrats. But before I introduce the two guests tonight, I'd like to throw over to the editor of The Right Stuff, Misha Zelinsky.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining. I'll be very quick because I understand everyone, I'm not the star of the show. Everyone wants to very quickly get to hear from Senator Keneally and from Wayne Swan. So look, thanks, Michael, for hosting this event. I think The Right Stuff, it's been very well discussed. It certainly made a bit of a splash, and the thing behind the book is the Labor Party, we are obviously a party of ideas, we believe in things, but the thesis behind the book is that we are a party of government. And so the book is really about saying, okay, what are the ideas? What's the pathway for us to turn ideas into action? And we know that is done through government. And so we contributed from 30 of the leading thinkers in the party, not just in the parliamentary wing of the party, but in local government, the Labor movement, unions, etc. And so it's a big thank you to everyone who contributed. If you haven't already bought a copy, buy yourself two. One for your best friend or someone that you really dislike, and to force them to read 30 Labor essays. But no, look, in all seriousness, thank you to everyone who supported the book. Thank you for coming along tonight. And I won't take up any more of the short, precious time. I'll hand it back to the key guest. And thank you, Michael, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Misha. Appreciate it. And please go out and buy the book. Tonight we're joined by two of the thought leaders that we've mentioned earlier. The first is Wayne Swan, former Treasurer of Australia, who took us through the global financial crisis, former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. He's joined by Kristina Keneally, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs. And at this time, when we're all discussing the role of state governments, she also brings that perspective too, as a former Premier of New South Wales. So welcome, Wayne and Kristina.
Good to be with you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to start, what struck me most about the book was the diversity of opinions and the diversity of the subject matters within the book. So maybe starting with you, Wayne, what made you want to contribute to a book like this?
Well, I think it's a continuation of a theme that is characterised by political life. And I think the Labor Party is first and foremost a party that looks after the economic interests of working people, with a very strong belief in equality, particularly economic equality, gender equality, racial equality. And around the world, it's been slim pickings for social democratic parties and Labor parties over the last decade. And what motivates me is to understand what we need to do to implement our policies and win back government, because if we don't win government, all the best policies in the world aren't going to take us anywhere. So we need to be on the right side of history when it comes to the big issues. But if we can't win elections, then we're in deep trouble. And the problem around the world for the last 10 or 20 years is social democratic parties and Labor parties in many countries have simply disappeared. And we would still be one of the strongest Labor and strongest democratic socialist parties in the world. But we need to be winning elections more consistently. So we've got to have our idealism, but it's got to be tinged with strong pragmatism to win elections.
Well, you mentioned economic insecurity and scare campaigns in your chapter, forming a potent mix. You're dealing with scare campaigns all the time, Kristina. How are you finding that on a day-to-day basis? How do you respond to that?
Well, look, I think the first thing that's interesting about tonight's conversation, and you talk about scare campaigns and pathways to government, is that Wayne and I, in both of our chapters and in both of our areas of responsibility and interest, deal with what I would call the claim to government portfolios, economic management and national security. And our opponents claim a undeserved superiority in both of these areas, and unfortunately, an uncritical media too often repeat the tropes and give the credit where quite arguably, it is not due. And so I think when we think about elections to government, part of my challenge in home affairs and is to ensure that while I don't think we're going to win an election, and I'm not really sure anyone wins an election on national security matters, you can certainly lose one. And so it's about putting forward the robust argument for our claim to government and our capacity and willingness to engage in the debates that will ensure that Australia remains safe, safe from terrorist threats, safe from cybersecurity threats, safe from foreign interference, safe from right-wing extremism. I think in the economic management portfolio, there's a lot more space for us in terms of differences with our opponents. Wayne's been a great voice on that, as well as their claim to jobs and wages and our plan to fix up the industrial relations system that Anthony's outlined. But really with these scare campaigns, those have abated a bit in the national security space, but they haven't gone away entirely during COVID. And I think the point of my chapter was to put forward a robust argument for Labor's claim to the national security architecture that we now have, and to frame some of the issues we will have to deal with in the now and into the over the next few years. Absolutely.
Well, Wayne, your article, your chapter becomes somewhat of a call not to abandon visionary policies, but to embrace them, but to continue it as and do it in a more effective way. What I was interested in is you talk a bit about loss aversion, you talk about the challenge with agenda items. Does that mean that reformist governments or reformist oppositions will always have a disadvantage in politics?
No, it doesn't necessarily, but we ought to acknowledge that the power has shifted fundamentally in politics. The power of big money is more important than ever, but also the power of big media, which has become increasingly conservative, has also been a bigger hurdle. If we can take great heart, I think, from, say, the election win of Joe Biden, who managed to stare down the big scare campaigns, particularly in climate and the economy, in the recent elections in the United States. I think it would be fair to say that we wouldn't necessarily be looking at the same result if someone with a wider range of far more progressive policies had actually been the presidential candidate. So the point I make about our last election is that we got the progressive shape of our policy right, but I think it was too big. And when it became so large, it became far easier for the Murdoch media in particular and for big money to distort and scare vulnerable people. I mean, one of the real ironies in politics is as the world has become more unequal, it hasn't presented the opportunities for parties of the centre-left to prosper. In fact, it's allowed the authoritarian right that specialises in scaring people, particularly through the use of race and gender and climate change, scaring them away from supporting policies in their economic interests by using culture and identity politics to scare people. And we've seen that in the climate change debate, not just in Australia, but right across Europe. It didn't get anywhere in the United States because Joe Biden was much more effective in putting the proposition that action on climate change will deliver jobs. And he said, you say climate change, I say jobs. I say good quality jobs. I say union jobs. So we've got to learn a lot more about how we construct our progressive agendas and how we communicate them, to taking into account the challenges that come against us from big money and the hard right.
Well, you almost talk there a bit about framing things more in a positive agenda. And one of the lines that I absolutely loved, I thought it was an instant hit, was that the working and middle classes are a source of growth, not just the result of it. Talk me through that, please.
Well, I mean, there's been a revolution in economics. I mean, for 30 odd years, everybody eulogised trickle-down economics. Give everything to the people at the top, they'll spend it, it'll trickle down and everybody will do well. It's crap. It was crap when they started it, and it's even crappier now. The truth is that we ignore the distributional implications of our policies at our peril. And too many progressive parties across the world ignored those distributional challenges, particularly the Democrats in the United States, even under democratic administrations. The Labor Party in this country, because it is a Labor Party and sees economic democracy to the forefront of everything we think, understands it's how you create the wealth that's just as important as how you distribute it. And if you find unfair ways to create wealth, you'll get very much unfair distribution. So that's why wages, progressive tax, all of those sorts of issues are very much to the forefront. Now, they present and make us a much larger target, but there is no choice if we want to be on the right side of history and we want to see a far fairer society and a more prosperous economy, to keep arguing for a fairer distribution of wealth and income. And that's what, for example, distinguishes us from the Greens. We think economic democracy is the core of political action. That's what we think. That's why we're a Labor Party. That's why we're Laborists. That's why we're different from the Greens. That's why we're different from any number of other so-called progressive parties around the world.
Brilliant. Well, one of the things that you also touch on that maybe is linked to this sort of more positive agenda you have, and I've heard you say it a lot, Kristina, so I'd love to get your thoughts, but is the challenge of listening to people and listening to the right people. And that you, Wayne, in your chapter mentioned examples where we haven't done that in the United States, the UK, and here. So tell me, who is, when you say we've stopped listening, what do you mean, and who should we be listening to?
Who's the question to?
Sorry, I might start with you, Wayne, and then we'll go to Kristina.
Well, I think I used in the article the example of a truck driver from Logan City. They could be a steel worker in Wollongong. You know, we didn't win enough working class votes in the last election, and they're precisely the sort of votes that have been lost around the world. But they're also not just blue collar votes, they're pink collar votes and so on. We haven't been winning the lower income earners. And one of the reasons we haven't is that the Conservatives have deployed particularly identity politics, and race in particular, to scare people like that. So one of our challenges is to get them to hear our economic voice in the first place, because if all they ever hear is a debate about some aspect of social policy, what tends to happen is it drowns out the sort of fundamental messages that the Labor Party has. It doesn't mean to say that those issues aren't important, but the most fundamental task of a Labor Party is to ram home an economic message that true equality starts with economic inequality and then spreads out. I mean, if you go to Martin Luther King, I mean, the march they made in the 60s was entitled Jobs and Freedom. What distinguishes us as a party is that we understand that with economic equality comes the prospect of full racial equality, gender equality, and so
on. Look, I'll just join in that and agree with everything Wayne has said, but I'd add, in terms of the groups we struggled to talk to over the last term, and reflect upon Sam Crosby's chapter in this book, where he talks about people of faith and his own faith and how it forms his Labor politics. And, I regret that in some circumstances we have failed to, and it's people like me as well who are people of faith, to contextualize and speak to people of faith and people from different faiths and different backgrounds to reflect, for example, with Catholic social teaching, that in many ways it's quite parallel to the argument Wayne just put about economic equality. And, the fact that we have allowed a drift that allowed some of those social policy debates to portray us in ways that might have seemed like we were not open to views of people of faith, I think is unfortunate. And, Anthony Albanese as leader has done a great deal of work in this space, and I think that we are getting that back. Let's be blunt, our movement has struggled with this since the split in the 1950s. But nonetheless, there are groups of people in the community that need to know and need to feel like their lives, their values, and their aspirations are reflected in not just the elected representatives of our party, but in the party itself and in the policies that we put forward. Michael, I think you're muted.
we need to have a broad as possible coalition. So we can't have the luxury of just saying we have to have everybody in the tent. If you don't agree 100%, then see you later. I mean, this is the point of my chapter, that we do have to build a broad coalition to secure government. And it's even more important to have a broad coalition when you look at the power of big money that we face and the power of big media that we face, who are always set and ready there to exploit any of these issues. So we have to be smart in our campaigning. And we also have to be tolerant of other people who may not agree with us on a number of issues, because what's our priority? It'll be their priority. The thing that they want for their families is a decent wage, decent services, and a government that at least respects their views, even if they don't agree with them.
Absolutely. I'm conscious that we better get to your chapter too, Kristina, but I've got 1,000 questions for you, Wayne, and maybe we'll come back to them at the end. For anyone listening and you would like to raise a question, please use the Q&A function. We will be watching it, and hopefully we'll get to a few of your questions later this evening. But Kristina, your chapter is centred around security, not something that people associate necessarily with Labor or progressive parties, but you give a lot of credit to the Hawke and the Hawke government for setting up the modern national security infrastructure, something most people would associate economics. But why do you link security, and why have they been such a success?
Let's understand that Bob Hawke's government gifted us the national security infrastructure that has been so successful for Australia today. And he gets all the rightful credit for the economic reforms, the Hawke-Keating reforms. But when it comes to national security, just a very brief bit of context. When Hawke came to government, ASIO had been a highly political organization. In fact, the Labor Party in 1972 came close to passing a motion that we should abolish ASIO. And it had been highly politicized by the Menzies government in particular, and targeting not just political opponents in the Labor Party, but civil society and unions and others. And there had been a series of royal commissions into to the national security infrastructure. And when Hawke came to government, he instituted the second one, the Hawke Royal Commission, which really gifted us the architecture that we have today, the independent oversight, the principles by which our national security agencies operate. But one of the most important things that Bob Hawke did, and it was actually acting against the advice of Justice Hope in his Royal Commission, was he set up the equivalent of what is today now the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, which has created a unique Australian thing, which is a bipartisan compact on security. And bipartisan doesn't mean automatic agreement, but it means that there is a space within the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security for members of the parties of government, coalition, and the Labor Party to come together in a non-partisan way, to have genuine conversations in the national interest, to eschew partisanship, and to develop policies, legislation, recommendations about what is genuinely in the national interest. And governments of both stripes, so since the time of Hawke, have generally regarded the recommendations of the PJCIS and taken them forward. So this bipartisan compact has allowed us to sidestep the type of partisanship you see in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and other places, but particularly in the US, where national security becomes a political football. And it is to our benefit, and it is to the country's benefit, that we look to preserve that compact where we can.
Well, you mentioned that some of the challenging, maybe partisan approaches in the 70s. I'd like to actually ask Wayne about this, having spent, I think, 24 years as the member for Lilly. Do you think things are changing again? Have you seen a shift in the trust we have for our national security institutions? There was obviously more recently, there's been debate around AFP and media and so on. Have you seen a shift?
I certainly think under this current Conservative government, that there's nothing they won't politicise or make partisan. And, it's pretty disgusting. I was actually around for the Hope Report. I was then working for Mick Young, who was actually the genesis of it. So I remember it well. But, I think, for example, we've seen on China just how deeply irresponsible this government is when it comes to some of these issues. To go out and inflame the debate about the issues of COVID, the way in which they did for partisan gain, was one of the worst things I've seen in many years in this field, because its implications are severe. And they just can't help themselves when it comes to many of our institutions about turning them into deeply partisan issues, or fiddling with them, or making inappropriate appointments. The sort of work that Kristina has done highlighting just how bad this current government is when it comes to due process is good work, and I think will become a central issue of the next election, because they're sort of doing it now in response to the issues that we're debating at great length now. There's just a lack of process, due process, decency, democratic practice, accountability in just about anything this government does.
I mean, that's not really, you're not painting a rosy picture there, Wayne.
No.
But Kristina, you end your chapter, if I can give it away, with almost a passionate defense of the bipartisanship approach. So how do you reconcile your view on wanting this bipartisan approach if things are starting to shift in the opposite direction? How do you reconcile that?
Look, and Wayne is right. I mean, we've seen, the leaking of ASIO information during the Medevac debate. We've seen, the tip-off of police raids with McKell Cash. And there are points within, legislation, particularly the metadata laws, where, that compact has been strained but not completely broken. And so I think we don't stay silent when there are issues that demand attention. And so Labor has, whether it's been around foreign interference, right-wing extremism, cybersecurity, these are coming and growing threats to our national security, and Labor hasn't been silent on them. But we've sought to work in a where we can in a bipartisan way. And I think it's about keeping your there's the politics, and Wayne is spot on. This government, if there's something they can politicize, they will. But yet through the work of the committee, and I think a lot of it happens in ways that people don't quite see and appreciate, but through the work of the committee, where we do still have that compact that exists, we should seek to preserve it as much as possible, because it suits us and it suits the community. And ultimately, I think it suits the Liberal Party as well. It saves them from their worst instincts. So it's a balancing act, but I think we need to acknowledge that this is a unique aspect of our political landscape, and one we should not walk away from. And that is also a warning to us when we think about some of these issues. I mean, it would be quite easy to go out and overly politicized right-wing extremism. I think we've sought to be responsible. We've sought to raise it in a very pointed and direct way, and that has resulted in for the first time, Labor moved a motion in the House of Representatives to refer something to the PJCIS, and the government ultimately had to come to the party, negotiate terms of reference with me, and make its own referral. So there are ways that we can seek to do to achieve our ends to keep Australians safe. But the bipartisan compact is not one we should give up easily, and we should seek to keep our partners in the coalition at the table.
Maybe a long bow, but can I ask, we just had the Royal Commission into aged care earlier in the week. Would you recommend, but Hawke's establishment of parliamentary oversight was actually going against the recommendations of a Royal Commission, and yet it seems to have turned out, you praise it quite a lot. Would ignoring a Royal Commission be something you usually recommend?
Well, I mean, Keating, I think I've heard Paul Keating say that you're often defined by the advice you reject. And I think that there is some truth in that. I know from my time in state government, there were times we rejected Treasury advice. They were completely opposed to the My Zone ticketing system in New South Wales, but it was the right policy. So, Royal Commissions are not, they are not the end all and the be all. Governments still have to govern and make decisions. That being said, I think what the Royal Commission into Aged Care showed really quite remarkably that there was a difference of opinion between the two commissioners, which I think probably left the government in a worse position now. And you can see that the way they're handling this, they're quite struggling. I mean, they've been struggling in aged care now for some time since they came to office, but review after review. But now I think they thought they might get, the clear pathway forward and the steps they needed to take. And now they actually have to make decisions and govern.
Thank you. We are receiving a lot of questions, so I might let us take over to some of the questions that are coming through this evening. Could I start with Wayne? Why doesn't the ALP just enter into coalition with the Greens?
Because we're a separate party with separate interests. I am not afraid to work with like-minded parties when there is common ground, and it's history that the Greens knocked back the first carbon pollution reduction scheme, and we could have had that in place. It's also true that when we came back to government in 2010, we worked with the Greens to bring in carbon pricing. So I'm not one of those who says I won't work with like-minded parties where there are like-minded issues in the national interest. But I am one who absolutely believes that my party, the Labor Party, is a force for government in this country, and I don't believe the Greens ever will be, for a whole variety of reasons. But am I opposed to dealing with the Greens sensibly on sensible issues where there's agreement? No, I'm not opposed to that at all. But what we do need to understand is that in this country, you've got to elect a majority government. And the only party that can do that on the progressive side is the Labor Party.
Well, that one was from Paul, so I hope that answers your question. And Nathan asks, Kristina, not quite related to your essay, but to what extent do you think the election will be won or lost on how safe women feel in Australia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really good question, and the debate we're having right now, I feel, the horrible allegations of rape that have occurred, the horrible rapes that have been alleged to have occurred, are just terrible. And I feel at one level like we might be on the precipice of some type of shift or change in society, particularly when it comes to understanding these issues. What I would say is, well, I don't know that come election time, which could be, in 7 months or could be in, much longer, a year or so. I'm not sure that we know yet exactly what the defining issues of that election will be. There is so much uncertainty in the economy. There's so much uncertainty in the COVID rollout. There's vaccine rollout. There's so much uncertainty in our relationship with China that it's really hard to say what the particular defining issues will be beyond jobs and wages, which will be no doubt front and center. But I think the challenge for the Liberals is that the tag that they now have is that they don't get women, they don't understand women, they don't have a lot of women, they don't, they've rejected the childcare policy, they have been appalling in their response to these rape allegations, they don't have gender quotas or gender targets. They've had so many stories of bullying and harassment and assault internally that I think they are really going to struggle when it comes to portraying themselves as on the side of Australian women.
Peter asks, as a Catholic, I feel that many Catholics don't see Labor values as contrary to their beliefs, particularly in Australia and the United States. Do you think it's a failure of Christianity or a failure of Labor values, or why has this disconnect occurred? And should the parties provide values leadership?
Well, absolutely. And, I would point people to a few things. One, Joe Biden's Catholicism on his sleeve and how he weaves that into the way he thinks about the economy, about equality, and about people's rights at work. Secondly, I wrote a piece for the quarterly essay after the election that really sought to root Catholic social teaching and Labor policy in the same place, because they do very much emanate from the same place as communitarian, collective, and in terms of creating opportunity and equality and for people who are economically disadvantaged. And so my frustration, and I share this frustration, Paul, I think it's that on the one level, I get very frustrated with my church, which spends, in my view, way too much time talking about sexual morality and sexual and birth control and other issues in the public square, when so much of what they have to say about Indigenous reconciliation, about economic inequality, about environment, is so much more relevant to the whole of the population, and so much more consistent with the positions that the Australian Labor Party takes. And then I get frustrated at times with my party because we don't seem to understand that there is so much more to Catholic teaching than just around the sexual morality. So this is a project I have embraced internally and externally to see if we can try to bridge some of those divides and find the common ground that does undoubtedly exist.
I know we're running out of time, but I'm just going to ask one more question. This one to you, Wayne. But it's really two questions from Teresa. Do you agree with Kevin? It's a Kevin Rudd suggestion, I believe, that Labor needs to go on the attack more in future elections. And also, with so many range of ideas in a book, I think we need another book with taking suggestions from rank and file party members.
No, I think what we need is real activism on the ground. Books can only take you so far. You got to, campaigning is not all about swipes and wipes and so on. It's actually about getting out there on the ground and doing the hard work and being organised and being committed. And it's remembering where you came from and why you're there. I mean, I've had a great demonstration of this week, because when I watched Christian Porter stand up and say there's never been anyone in the history of Australian politics who's been subject to the sort of vilification I have over issues that happened 30 years ago. And I said, hang on a minute. Didn't Australia's biggest misogynist, Prime Minister Tony Abbott, appoint a judge, Dyson Hayden, to investigate Australia's first female Prime Minister over allegations that were incredibly dodgy allegations over 30 years old? And what I've been stunned about, and this is a measure of what we're up against in the Australian Labor Party when we want to campaign out there, is that the mainstream media, and in particular the Murdoch media, have given the government a free pass on that background, when clearly there is terrible form in the treatment of former Prime Minister Gillard and many other issues, which indicate that they're not entitled to the good faith and doubt that they're asking the electorate to give them.
I think that we've covered a lot of topics here tonight, and I want to thank you, Wayne and Kristina, for joining us. Your contributions are fantastic to the book, and I really urge everyone to read it. You can get the right stuff from Connor Court Publishing, so the link is in our RSVP email. So thank you so much, Wayne and Kristina, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone at home, for joining us tonight. We will be back with future series on some of the books that are making the headlines in public policy in Australia. So thank you very much for joining us, and good evening.